Autumn for Black Tree, written and read by Oliver Tonic. This is a completed novella, read as a series. These last few episodes are the ending of the story. You can enjoy it from here on, but if you haven't already, I would highly recommend going back to the beginning to get the full impact. Now, if you're still here, enjoy the conclusion of Autumn for Black Tree. Episode 14. A Meeting of Monsters. It was late, but Kaporia couldn't sleep. She had spent the night dealing with her insomnia, going over the details of a crystal chandelier she had received for the ball the next day. She thought it was all wrong, as it was not at all the style she had expected. Additionally, it had some defects on it that she knew she would notice, even if nobody else would. Her helpers bobbed their heads, trying to stay awake as she went over every tiny detail and figured out what could be replaced, or if the whole thing just needed to be sent back. She had decided there clearly wasn't enough time before the party, so she was making do and having them remove each defective piece and replacing it with the ones from another chandelier she had retired. She was just about to finally retire herself for the night as she walked upstairs, sending her helpers away. She smelled the sudden odor of smoke. On the way to her bedroom, she passed the doorway to her project room where she had stored all the party gifts for the next day. From underneath the door seeped burnt-smelling wisps. Kaporia was now on high alert after she had just wound herself down. She ran to the door and swung it open. She had to cover her face as she was hit with a burst of heat and yellow light. There in the room was a bonfire encompassing every corner. Her burning party gifts were alight in a pyre everywhere except the center of the room. There stood Paxis in her dark gray suit on her top and bottom, facing the queen with her hands in fists and a light in her eyes. She was stone-faced as she looked on at her mother. The queen was in horror. Paxis watched as her mother's face alternated between terror and pain. She watched her precious work go up in literal smoke. Then, in an instant, the queen's face turned to rage. She saw in it the kind of pure, unbridled rage that sent a shiver down her spine. And then it became something more. Kaporia's eyes turned a deep, dark, glowing maroon before splitting in two. Each side of her face held two large, dark marbles where her eyes should be. They were set above a row of teeth that looked as though they sprouted right from her lips. Her forehead elongated and became dark and ribbed as seam by seam her nightgown began to rip apart. Large ribbed and black scales pierced through them as her forearms grew large with claws for hands and massive ribbed horns for elbows. She reared up as she grew, and set after set of clawed appendages could be seen sprouting from her belly and chest. By the time her two legs had sprouted to many black clawed ones that were hind-set on her body, Paxis hadn't had time to move. It had all happened so fast, even though the shock of it had made it feel like time had slowed. Paxis thought she might be frozen until a massive claw fist came careening towards her. She leapt and stumbled out of the way. Before the creature could get her bearings, Paxis had already staggered underneath her and passed her towards the door. Kaporia's giant arm was lodged in the flames now, and she took this opportunity to put out what she could. She swung her enormous arms around the room, stamping out heaps of fire as she did so. Her body was massive, and as Paxis ran out of the room, she looked back for a brief moment. She was astonished that she managed to fit in the room at all. This gave her the smallest bit of relief, however, as she supposed the creature she had become wouldn't be able to fit back through the doorway in her current state. Paxis made her way down the corridor and down the stairs to the large dining hall. The castle was dark and cold as the pitter-patter of her feet along with muffled roars echoed into the empty space. Paxis didn't have much more to her plan after the sabotage of the gift, so she thought she would just head for the exit. As she sprinted toward the next stairway out of the dining hall, a hush seemed to fall over the air like something was suspended. She turned around and saw a giant stone brick indeed suspended in the air as it was hurled toward her. She ducked and it crashed just ahead of her with a terrifying sense of weight. It partially blocked her immediate exit. She turned to face the source and saw the beetle Kaporia at the top of the staircase that Paxis had just come from. Her legs were sticking to the wall behind her. A large piece was missing from the corridor that led from the project room. She leaped down and landed on the long dining room table, cracking it in the middle and making it cave in on itself with a snap. Paxis breathed deep. The horn on Caporia's head angled toward her. It was nearly as large as a naval ram, and it loosely mimicked the shape of one, too. Her mini legs shuffled as she gathered herself to charge. Just as she started toward her, Paxis released a torrent of flames from her mouth. The heat was so intense that even Paxis had to step back as it connected with the front of the beast's horned face. Caporia put her massive claws up to resist the blast. The hit derailed the queen from her path as she closed her eyes from the heat and light. Paxis stepped out of the way as she struck the corner of the wall behind her. The castle rumbled, and stone broke off from the point of impact. Paxis kept blowing her oral flamethrower at the back of the creature until she turned around and shielded herself again from the flames. Paxis walked forward, bearing down on her. Caporia's mini leg shifted to the stone wall and she began to climb up, still holding up her claw. She began running on the side of the wall, and Paxis was shocked at her speed. Flames shot all over the room as she tried to keep up with her fire breath. Caporia outran the flames and went a full circle on the walls around the room. Paxis stopped to catch her breath just as Caporia had reached a wall behind her. The Beetle Queen used this opportunity to lunge out and strike her with the back of her arm. Paxis found herself flying through the air. The ground dropped further out from underneath her as her body flew over the stairs and out of the dining room. Time slowed for her as she saw her own descent and realized how much it was going to hurt when she hit. She was right. She scraped her shoulder as she skidded on the floor first. Then she flipped and hit her shoulder blade on the other side. Her arm and side took the brunt of it, though, as the friction of tumbling brought her to a stop. She laid there for a few seconds, trying to take account of the damage. The pain hadn't quite come yet as she heard her mother roar from the other side of the room. Her angry footfalls were like pistons as she made her way down the stairs to her position. She hurt, but whatever damage was there was being drowned out by the fear and stimulation. She decided to take advantage of that. She pushed herself off the ground and watched, hunched over, as the beetle drew closer. She wasn't ready for her again, and she knew it. She looked to her side and saw her out. It was a door that led to the main kitchen. She knew the beetle wasn't going to easily be able to fit through it. She ran in and closed the door behind her. The kitchen was large, dark, and full of places for cover, but she knew it was too obvious to hide there, so she took the opportunity to create distance. She ran past the pots and pans and the massive stove to the other side of the room with an exit that led to another hall. She slammed the door behind her, grateful she hadn't yet heard her mother reach the kitchen. She turned around and jumped at the sight of Barley. He was smiling his gentle smile, but it quickly turned to worry. What's going on? Paxis looked down and saw the keys sticking out of his pocket. Give me those. Okay, he said as she snatched them up and fumbled through the key ring. She found the one she wanted and clumsily locked the door. She had barely been able to get it into the keyhole due to shaking so much. It's my mother, she said at the exact moment the doorknob was tried, followed by a thud against the door like someone was trying to bust it open with their shoulder. Let's go, Paxis said as she grabbed Barley by the hand and began running with him down the hallway. It didn't go well with her, huh? Barley asked, following in step. A thunderous crash shook the corridor as pieces of stone and brick shattered along with the wooden door that came from the kitchen. Barley looked back, but Paxis kept right on running, holding his hand tight. Whoa! He cried, being drowned out by the noise. A hideous cry rang out with the crash. The beetle beast Caporia slid into view from the force of her strike as the debris fell around her. Barley's eyes couldn't open wide enough to take in the sight. The beetle is here? As the beast's many hind legs gripped the stone floor and sent its massive body toward them, it clicked in Barley's mind. Your mother, he whispered under his breath, still running. Paxis reached the open courtyard with Barley. It was a green open area with some nicely trimmed bushes and floral arrangements. The hallway led to it and turned into a perimeter around it with pillars holding up an overpass above. The stars and the night air greeted them as though it was unaware of the danger that trailed behind them. Paxis came to a stop and looked around, trying to figure out what to do next. Barley began to take off his belt and sheath loaded with his sword. This actually makes a whole lot of sense, he said contemplatively, and Paxis thought a bit too casually for the situation they were in. He handed her his weapon. Tie this around you tight if you can. I don't think we're the same size. Paxis turned around and did so as she saw her mother getting closer. Barley's tone had sounded irritatingly like a joke at a time like this. She removed it from its sheath and brandished the sword in her hand. Her mother saw this in her thundering approach, and the massive beast felt a tinge of fear as she saw the two take their station before her. Her daughter was standing fast with a moonlit sword next to the tree knight who had just sprouted long wooded edges from both his wrists. This prompted her to hit a pillar with her ramming horn just before reaching them. It rocked the hall and caused the column to crack. The rupture traveled upwards to the walkway above. Kaporia backed up quickly as part of the overpass began to cave in. Barley looked up and yelled at Paxis to run. She did so, but it was clear neither of them was going to be quite fast enough to get out from under it in time. Barley covered his head. From his back, in almost an instant, sprouted tree branches just thick enough to hold the falling structure at bay for a brief moment. Paxis made it out and looked back in time to see Barley make the roots growing from his back brittle. He snapped them off as he rolled out from under the newly grown tree to safety. The branches quickly gave way and the stones crushed the makeshift tree. They had both made it out of harm's way. Kaporia's fearsome teeth gnashed together as she reared back beyond the pile of stones in the now partially caved-in corridor. She took a flying leap into the sky. They watched in astonishment as she soared over their heads and landed with a thud in the middle of the grassy courtyard. She came at Paxis first, swinging her claws wildly at her. Paxis knew she couldn't sustain many, if any, of her direct hits, so she remembered what she had learned from Barley's training and dodged them. Barley noticed that she moved not unlike a cat. It was almost like a dance as she narrowly and swiftly missed collisions from the strikes. Her mother dug up the dirt from the courtyard with each failed blow. A few times the metal of her blade was used to deflect, scraping against the queen's ribbed exoskeleton as if they both held swords. Paxis had actually managed to handspring away to get some distance, and Barley excitedly and involuntarily clapped his hands together at the girl's flare. This caught Kaporia's attention, and she came charging for the knight. Barley sidestepped her. As he did, he caught the soft side of her abdomen with his wooden wrist blades. Kaporia screamed in pain and rage and managed to snatch Barley up. She threw him across the courtyard. As he spun through the air, he grew vines that extended from his back and shoulders. They were reaching out for a hold when his body reached the perimeter and they caught around two pillars. This held Barley, suspended between them in an extended net of vines. Barley cursed himself, disappointed that he had been distracted enough to allow Kaporia to catch him. In his head flashed the image of her having crushed him effortlessly in her claws. He knew it was only by chance that she was too angry to think to do that. This swirl of thoughts made him lose control of his vines. He couldn't kill the roots in his back, so he couldn't break them off and free himself from his position. Kaporia was coming. He looked like a fly caught in a web, and she was the spider. This was the worst possible time to forget his deadening trick. If he got worked up, his vines and branches stayed strong and hardened like the tree Paxis had found him in, and as Kaporia was raging toward him with her ramming horn, he knew this might be the last mistake he ever made. Meters from her strike, a blazing fury came between them. A fire cat in all her glory stood before her beetle mother and roared a mighty roar. Kaporia slowed, and before she could react, Paxis had jumped toward her with such force that she flipped her enormous body on its back. Her capable flaming paws smacked the face of the monster again and again. As she did, Paxis realized she still had the holster for the sword tied to her. Amazingly, it had not fallen off when she changed, but it was now burning up. Paxis' punches became softer as her paws became hands again and the flames died down. The sword fell from what was left of the sheath. It slid between the floundering beetle arms on her mother's body. She reached for it just as Kaporia's massive claw came down on her to rip her from her chest. Paxis plunged the weapon into the middle of her reaching claw. A howl of pain rang through the night. Paxis was pushed down off of the beast as Kaporia got up. She looked at the sword protruding from her monstrous hand. Even her fearsome face was able to contort in terror. She opened her rows of sharp teeth and green smoke began to waft out. Paxis tried to get clear, but it was too late. She billowed a thick green smoke all over the courtyard. Barley, still hanging, was coughing violently while Paxis was doubled over. The queen turned from the two and ran to the next tower on the opposite side of the courtyard. It had an entrance of 2 tall and narrow doors. It was a large space that the queen had dubbed her festivities hall. She broke through the doors and disappeared inside, out of view of the knight and the servant girl, who were still in a cloud of smoke. They continued to cough profusely until the cloud dissolved into the air. Barley heard Pax's cough stop sounding so much like a cough and more like a laugh. He looked at her. She was trying to hold herself up now, almost completely on the ground, but she was indeed laughing. "What?" he said, still hacking. She looked up to him, still smiling between her covered mouth. "I just keep thinking about how glad I am that my tail fit through the hole in my shorts," she said. "I think I'm a little too unreasonably proud of that right now." They both laughed deliriously. "Oh man, I gotta get down from here," said Barley, wiping a tear from his watery eyes. The vines on his back began to weaken as Barley's confidence grew. They suddenly became totally decrepit and cracked under his weight. It was so quick that Barley barely caught himself on the floor with his hands when he landed. He got up and tried to shake the soreness from his palms. "I need my sword back," he said. Paxis stood and looked at the entrance to the tower. "I'm sure she's got a plan for us in there if we go—" No, said Barley. "I can get myself a new one. I don't need the aggravation." Pax's face looked concerned. "We aren't going after her?" Barley smiled as he deadened the wooden blades on his arms and used each hand to break them off. Paxis thought they crumbled almost like crackers. "No, Paxis, we are not going into the tower to kill your mother," he said with a chuckle. It struck her then. What was her plan? He was right. They couldn't go and just slay her like any other monster. So what was the end game? "But you're a hunter. What are we supposed to do now?" "Well, I'm not really in the business of usurping thrones or tearing down kingdoms," said the knight. "I think we ought to take our leave." He began walking back the way they came toward the rubble hallway. "So that's it?" Paxis asked, following behind him. Barley shrugged. "Yeah, I mean, you can't just dethrone someone. It's not my place. Plus, then it creates a power vacuum and the land starts to tear itself apart in civil war, and it just becomes a whole thing." He reached the fallen structure and began climbing over the mess of stone and branches until he made it to the other side. "Also, you have to think of Toka. How would he feel without a mother or a kingdom? Your brother has to have some structure, even if it—" He turned around. She wasn't there. The silence had alerted him. He wondered how long she hadn't been following him. He climbed back to the top of the hill of debris. He couldn't see her anywhere in the courtyard. Hey guys, it's Oliver. Thank you so much for coming to my little corner of the internet to give me a listen. Give me a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe if you want to hear more of this or any of my upcoming stories I have in the works. I also have a Patreon. Your support helps me out a lot. I'll have weekly episodes up until all 18 parts of this story are fully released, so stay tuned.